The diner was buzzing like any other Saturday morning. Clinking coffee cups, quiet conversations, and the smell of fresh pancakes in the air. But at one corner table, something didn't sit right. An older man, clearly a veteran, sat quietly with his meal. His worn cap, marked with military patches, hinted at a life of service and sacrifice. But instead of thanks or kindness, a group nearby chose to mock him. His limp, his quietness, the way he struggled to lift his fork. Nothing was off limits to their whispers and laughter. He kept his head down, trying to ignore it, but the tension in the room grew thick. Across the room, a man in a crisp, buttoned-up shirt sat watching. No one knew much about him yet, just that he carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from years of leadership. Turns out he was a Marine colonel, just there for his morning coffee. He didn't say a word, didn't raise his voice. But what he did next left the entire diner stunned and silenced. In that moment, everything changed, not just for the veteran, but for everyone watching. Sometimes the strongest statements are made without a single word. What the colonel did was unexpected, powerful, and exactly what was needed. And as eyes turned to him, the bullies didn't seem so loud anymore. What happened next? Let's just say respect was restored in a way no one saw coming. The veteran sat quietly, his eyes focused on the plate in front of him, though he hadn't touched much of his food. You could see he was trying to disappear into his seat, like he'd been through this kind of thing before. Maybe not in a diner, but in life. His hand shook slightly as he lifted his coffee. The mocking had started small, whispers, a few giggles. But it didn't take long for the group of young men at the next table to get louder. They laughed at how he walked, how he spoke, and even made crude jokes about his service. What they didn't notice, though, was the man sitting just a few tables away, calmly observing everything. His presence didn't scream authority, but there was something in his posture, in the way he held his cup, that felt different. He wasn't just another customer. He looked like someone who had seen a lot, maybe even more than the veteran himself. What the group didn't know was that he was a Marine colonel, retired but still carrying the weight of his rank in how he moved, how he watched. As the laughter carried on, more people in the diner started to notice. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others kept their heads down, not wanting to get involved. But the colonel didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, without a word, and began walking toward the veteran's table. Conversations stopped. Forks froze midair. Everyone was watching. No one knew what he was about to do. The colonel didn't rush. Each step he took toward the veteran's table felt like it echoed across the room. The group of guys who had been laughing suddenly went quiet. You could see it in their eyes. They weren't sure if he was going to confront them or just walk past. The veteran glanced up, confused at first, maybe even a little nervous. He clearly didn't recognize the man approaching. But the colonel didn't look at the bullies. He kept his eyes on the veteran, like he saw something everyone else had missed. He reached the table and stopped, standing straight. Without a word, he raised his hand and gave the veteran a sharp, respectful salute. The kind of salute that carries years of service, loss, and pride behind it. For a second, the whole diner felt like it held its breath. The veteran, eyes wide, slowly returned the salute, his hand trembling slightly. The young men at the next table shifted uncomfortably. One of them muttered something under his breath, trying to laugh it off, but no one joined in this time. A waitress standing nearby wiped her hands on her apron, watching with a quiet, proud look. Another older man near the window leaned in, whispering something to his wife. Turns out he'd served too, and recognized the colonel from years ago. Something was changing in the room, but the real question was, what would the colonel do next? Because this wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. The colonel still stood there, his salute unbroken, his eyes locked on the veteran. There was something in that stare, something heavy, like he was communicating more than just respect. But the young men at the table were getting restless. One of them, a tall guy with messy hair and a cocky grin, stood up and pushed his chair back with a scrape that cut through the tension. His voice, though shaky, tried to sound confident as he said, "What's your problem, old man? You think you're some big shot." The colonel didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the guy. His attention stayed on the veteran, who was still holding his salute, unsure whether to sit or stand, unsure of what was about to happen. The young man's friends, sensing the rising tension, started to laugh nervously, but it didn't feel right anymore. They were all too aware of how many eyes were on them now. Even the waitress had stopped pretending to be busy. The veteran, still shaking, finally spoke up. I don't need any trouble," he mumbled, his voice cracking. But the colonel's presence didn't let the tension die down. It only made it worse, like the room was waiting for the storm to hit. The colonel's eyes flickered for just a moment, the smallest shift that suggested he was processing everything, the mockery, the discomfort, the pain in the veteran's voice. Then, just when it seemed like the situation would spiral out of control, the colonel took a step back. His voice, low but powerful, cut through the growing anxiety. "You don't understand," he said to the young man, his tone calm but laced with something much more dangerous. "You don't understand who you're talking to." The words hung in the air, and the young man froze. The weight of the colonel's gaze was enough to make even the loudest voice quiet. But the worst wasn't over, not by a long shot. The group of young men wasn't ready to back down, and the veteran, despite his trembling hands, still hadn't taken his seat. The entire diner was on edge, waiting for the next move, wondering how this would all unfold. Just as the tension reached its peak, a voice suddenly called out from across the diner. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. "What's going on here?" A new figure stepped into the scene, an older man wearing a jacket that looked a little too worn, but still sharp. His face was grizzled, his eyes hard. He looked like he'd spent decades in the military. But unlike the colonel, he wasn't as polished. He was rough around the edges, but his presence carried weight that hit the room like a punch. The young man who had been trying to challenge the colonel turned around, surprised to see the newcomer. "Who are you?" He scoffed, but the question barely left his lips before the man spoke again, his voice colder than anyone had expected. "I was wondering when you were going to show your true colors." The room went completely still. The colonel's expression barely changed, but something shifted. The veteran looked even more unsettled now, his hands clutching the edge of his table. The diner seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as the eyes of everyone turned from one person to the other. The new man made his way over to the table, not bothering with pleasantries. "You boys think you're tough, huh?" he said, his eyes scanning the group with disdain. "But you have no idea what you're messing with." His voice, though quiet, was heavy with experience, and his words stung. The young men began to look at each other nervously, their bravado slipping. One of them muttered something under his breath, but he was quickly silenced by the hard stare the older man gave him. Then, in a sudden move, the newcomer turned his gaze to the colonel. "Is this how it's going to go down? You're letting them get away with this." The colonel stood silent for a moment, but the words were already sinking in. The veteran, still unsure what was happening, sat frozen in his seat, the air thick with unspoken history. The stakes had just gone up, and now it wasn't just about one man's respect. It was about something far deeper. No one knew yet what this new twist meant, but it was clear this wasn't just a chance encounter. The tension was building towards something none of them could predict, and no one could back away now. The diner had become the battleground, and the final confrontation was about to unfold. The room was suffocating now, every eye on the colonel, the veteran, and the two men who had just entered the scene. The young men were no longer laughing. Their faces had drained of their earlier cockiness, replaced with uncertainty. The colonel didn't move, his gaze steady, unwavering, and now the older man, the newcomer, stood beside him, his presence as commanding as the colonel's. It was as if the two of them were a wall of unspoken authority, and the young men had nowhere to hide. The silence was unbearable, hanging like a thick fog, until the older man finally spoke again, his voice low but cutting. "You want to know what these men are made of?" he asked, addressing the young group. "You want to know what you're dealing with? Let me show you." He nodded towards the colonel, who stepped forward slowly, the tension in the room making every movement seem more deliberate. The young man who had first challenged him looked like he wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. The colonel didn't wait for him to speak. "You think you're tough," he said, his voice quiet but full of weight. "But you don't have a clue what real strength is." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, worn-out piece of paper. He unfolded it and slid it across the table to the veteran. The veteran's eyes widened as he saw the old military identification card on the table, the very one he had lost years ago, after his service. The veteran's hands trembled as he picked it up. He looked from the colonel to the newcomer, his voice barely a whisper. You knew." The older man nodded, his expression softening for the first time. "We served together. Long ago." The room fell even quieter. The truth was out. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. The colonel wasn't just standing up for a stranger. He was standing up for a brother. The young men were speechless now, the reality of the situation finally hitting them. But before they could process anything, the colonel turned to the veteran, giving him one final nod of respect. "You've earned this," he said. "We all have." The veteran looked at the paper in his hands, his expression finally shifting from fear to something else. Gratitude, but also a quiet understanding. He wasn't just a victim of cruelty anymore. He was part of a story much bigger than anything the bullies could have imagined. And just when the group was starting to back down, the twist came. The younger man who had been the loudest, the one who had tried to mock the veteran, stepped forward. But instead of making a snide comment, his shoulders sagged, and he spoke in a voice that no one had expected to hear. I'm sorry," he muttered, the words almost unrecognizable. The apology wasn't for the veteran, it was for himself. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." The room went completely still again. It wasn't just the colonel or the older man who had caused the shift. It was the realization that sometimes the hardest lesson isn't taught with fists or shouting. Sometimes it's taught with a quiet moment, a look, and a simple gesture of respect. The veteran smiled, the smallest of smiles, and for the first time, the diner felt like a place where something real had happened. The colonel, the veteran, and the old man stood together, and as they turned to leave, the young men remained seated, their heads down, feeling the weight of their actions. But the last surprise came when the colonel placed a hand on the shoulder of the young man who had apologized. "You'll be better," he said softly, "if you learn to stand tall." And with that, the three men walked out of the diner, leaving behind not just a lesson, but a reminder that sometimes the most powerful change comes when you least expect it. As the colonel, the veteran, and the older man walked out, the diner returned to an uneasy quiet. The group of young men sat still, processing everything that had just happened. The veteran, no longer a target of their mockery, remained at his table, his face soft with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, relief maybe. He had been seen. Not as a joke, not as a symbol of weakness, but as a man who had lived a life that deserved respect. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his past lifted, even if just for a moment. The young men at the table exchanged glances, the apology lingering in the air, unspoken but understood. It wasn't the words that mattered most. It was the change in their eyes, the realization of how far they had crossed a line, and how far they had to go to become better. For the first time, they saw the man behind the uniform, the stories hidden in the wrinkles of his face. They understood that strength wasn't always loud, and respect wasn't something you earned with arrogance. It was earned with humility. The colonel's final words echoed in the young man's mind as he sat there, feeling the weight of his own actions. "You'll be better." Those words weren't just a promise. They were a challenge. A challenge that, deep down, he knew he had to accept. The diner had been a stage for more than just a confrontation. It had been a moment of transformation, one that neither the veteran nor the young men would forget. And as the door closed behind the three men, the world outside felt a little bit quieter, a little bit more hopeful.